The sun was lazily setting beyond the horizon, casting deep reds and oranges across the sky, as if warning of something terrible looming just ahead. Josh and Maya walked together through the park, soaking up the last moments of daylight as the cool evening air began to settle around them. It had been a long time since they'd seen each other, and for a while, nothing seemed capable of disrupting the calm of their walk. They reminisced about high school, talked about summer plans, and Maya's laughter filled the quiet night. But soon, the silence around them started to feel unnatural. In the darkness of the park path, barely illuminated by distant streetlights, they could hardly see ahead. Josh felt a strange unease creeping up his spine, as if someone was watching them from the shadows. Maya, thankfully, hadn't noticed his worry and continued laughing at his jokes, oblivious to the thickening tension. Suddenly, as they rounded a bend in the path, they saw a figure standing there. The stranger was almost still, cloaked in darkness, with his face hidden in shadow, but his eyes cold, fierce, and unervingly intense, pierced right through them. He didn't move, yet something about him made it seem like he was waiting, ready to strike. Josh's heart started pounding faster. Excuse me, Josh said, trying to sound calm. We don't want any trouble. The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, never breaking eye contact. In his hand, something gleamed. The instant Josh recognized it as a knife, his heart sank. Maya, wide-eyed with terror, stepped back, her hands shaking as she tried to dial for help on her phone. "Think you can just run?" The man's voice sliced through the silence, dripping with venom. He lunged toward Josh, who felt a wave of paralyzing fear grip him, like icy hands closing in around his throat. Before he could react, the knife drove into his shoulder. Blood gushed, but he barely registered it. There was no time. Maya had already turned and was running into the dark, her screams piercing the night, while the man, grinning wickedly, charged after her. "Maya!" Josh screamed, forcing himself to move despite the burning pain. Each step felt like a struggle against his own body, his mind clouded with desperation and fear. The stranger was gaining on her, and in the faint light, Josh saw the blade flash again as it plunged into her stomach. She collapsed, powerless. Josh couldn't believe this was happening. The attacker, with a cruel smile, turned back toward Josh, raising the knife once more. Struggling to get up, Josh could barely move, his entire body racked with pain. Maya, barely conscious, reached out a trembling hand toward him. Everything went silent. Josh braced himself, accepting that this might be his end, but in that moment, something snapped. He didn't care about the danger anymore. He just had to protect her. With one last surge of strength, his hand found a rock on the ground. He swung it at the attacker with all his might. The stranger staggered but didn't fall, instead lunging forward again. Josh and Maya were nearly out of hope when the roar of a car engine suddenly broke the silence. Someone was approaching. The stranger turned toward the sound, then melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. Josh and Maya barely remembered the drive to the hospital. Everything felt like a haze. Flashes of faces, voices of medics trying to keep them conscious. As they bandaged Josh up, he stayed silent, his gaze vacant, hands still trembling. Maya lay quietly on the bed next to him, her usually steady eyes now clouded with deep fear. The police arrived shortly after, and Josh was forced to give a statement. He struggled to recall every detail of what had happened. As he described the attacker, his voice was hollow, yet each word intensified the despair growing within him. The officers listened intently, but no one could grasp the full extent of the horror he had faced. After a sleepless night in the hospital, Josh and Maya were finally allowed to go home. It seemed like it should all be over, but in reality, this was only the beginning. They sat silently in the car on the ride back. Maya, pale and drained, barely moved, her eyes fixed on some far-off point. Josh tried to focus, but a slow, relentless wave of anger and fear was rising within him, like dark waves before a storm. How did this happen? Anger was building up, taking hold of him, refusing to let him go. How had they lost control of what was supposed to be just a simple evening out? He could feel every muscle in his body tense, as though bracing for another blow. At home, his mother Martha was waiting for him in the kitchen. She immediately noticed his injured arm and the exhaustion etched across his face, moving toward him with alarm. Josh felt a surge of anger welling up. He couldn't quite place the source, but it was spreading through him like a dark cloud. His mind felt like it was slipping away, drowning in frustration. Her concerned gaze felt hollow, somehow empty. Suddenly, he found himself blaming her, feeling as though she was somehow responsible for all this pain, for all his fear and suffering. "What happened to you? You're covered in blood," she asked, her voice filled with worry and care. But Josh felt something entirely different. Her words felt like nothing to him, almost like an annoyance that fueled his anger. Her sympathy sounded like empty phrases that only irritated him more. He could feel his rage becoming almost unbearable. "How could she possibly understand what I'm going through?" he thought, and then suddenly he burst out. "Why did this have to happen to me?" He snapped, feeling the darkness inside him deepen. In his mother's eyes, it seemed like he was someone else, cold and unfamiliar. Her face froze, unsure of what was happening. When she took a step back, sensing his anger, it only fueled his irritation. In his rage, he saw none of her concern, only his own pain and frustration. A dangerous thought struck him suddenly. He remembered the axe in the garage. Cold, heavy, always kept in that dark corner. Almost without thinking, he turned and walked out of the house, heading toward the garage. Each step echoed in the silence of the empty yard, his heart beating hard and fast, propelling him forward. The garage door creaked open, and a cold light fell on the shelf with tools. There, among the old items, lay the axe, cold and glinting. He picked it up, feeling the metal handle slowly cooling his burning palm, as though it could somehow quiet the storm within him. His thoughts were chaotic, but one, cruel and clear, cut through them all. "She needs to understand the pain I'm feeling." When he stepped back into the house, holding the axe, his breathing was heavy, eyes filled with rage. He saw the hallway leading to the kitchen where his mother stood. She, still unaware, was standing there, believing that whatever was happening to her son was temporary. Step by step, Josh moved closer to the kitchen. The hallway was narrow, and each sound echoed like screams that wouldn't stop. He felt trapped by his own thoughts, but that didn't stop him. If anything, it made him go on. In his mind, there was only one rhythm, the pounding of his heart, pulsing with fury, despair, and anger. When Martha saw the weapon in his hands, she took a few steps back, her face reflecting pure terror. She whispered softly, "Josh, what are you going to do?" "It's me, your mother." Her words hit him like a cold wind, snapping him back to reality. Josh suddenly realized he was on the brink of something he could never undo. He looked at his mother, his breathing rapid, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. Martha froze in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes locked on Josh. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear nothing else, her mind scrambling for a way to calm it, to stop it, to avert the disaster that was approaching. He was coming closer with an expression she barely recognized. His eyes held pain, disappointment, and a dark resolve that twisted together in an eerie mix. That look, a gaze filled with desperation, seemed to erase everything good she had ever known about her son. "Josh, please," she said, her voice trembling, trying to keep her fear at bay. "You know I've always been here for you. Tell me what's happened, and we'll fix it together." But he only stepped closer, gripping the handle of the axe more tightly, his fingers digging into it as if her words spurred him on. "Always been there?" His voice sounded hollow. If it had been anyone else, she wouldn't have recognized her own son. "Do you even understand what it's like? To always be invisible, to never get what you need? I was screaming for you, and you just looked away." Martha felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground, knowing that trying to flee might provoke him further. "Josh, I never wanted you to feel like that. You're my child. I've always loved you," she spoke softly, almost pleadingly. as if trying to break through the wall that had grown between them. But his face remained unmoved. He looked at her as if her words only angered him more. Suddenly, he took a step forward, raising the axe. Without thinking, Martha threw herself to the side, barely dodging the blow that struck the wall with a loud crack. Kitchen items fell and clattered to the floor, creating more chaos. But she used the moment, darting toward the living room, putting as much distance between them as she could. "I never wanted this," Josh shouted, striding closer with a resolve that sent a chill through her veins. "But you forced me to. You always made me keep quiet, ignored me." Martha stopped, calculating how far she was from the exit, realizing that simply running might not be an option. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control over herself. "Josh, if I hurt you, I'm sorry," she said, almost pleading. "We can fix this, you know that?" He paused for a moment, as though her words had actually reached him. For an instant, something like hope, or perhaps doubt, flickered in his eyes. But the moment passed, and anger flooded his face again. "Fix it? You don't even know what needed fixing." His shout, filled with anguish and fury, cut through the air, making her step back once more. Martha was cornered, and her attempts to calm him seemed to be failing. Josh clenched his teeth, raised the axe, and brought it down with a fury she had never seen in him before. He no longer heard her words or even his own thoughts, only that deep, dark pain that finally erupted. The first blow made her stagger, but Josh didn't stop. His movements became mechanical, full of blind rage. Strike after strike, he continued, until everything around fell silent. When Martha was finally quiet, when the room lay in absolute stillness, Josh froze. He stared at the motionless figure before him, and a sudden awareness of reality began to seep through the thick veil of his anger. He looked down at his hands, stained with blood, feeling a cold, hollow emptiness grow inside him. Almost unconsciously, he stepped back, releasing the axe, which hit the floor with a dull thud. His mother's body lay lifeless, covered in blood. Josh moved to the stove, his fingers trembling as he turned on each burner one by one. The sharp, bitter scent of gas quickly filled the room, thick and suffocating. It was getting harder to breathe, and he felt his mind start to blur, drifting in a fog. But within that haze, a familiar struggle emerged. A desperate pull between his desire to end it all and a flicker of hope. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, he could be saved. "This is it. It's all over," he thought, feeling the darkness in his mind press in, whispering that nothing mattered anymore. He slumped to the kitchen floor, clutching his head in his hands. The gas smell was getting stronger, filling his lungs, making everything else feel distant and dull. But somewhere, deep within his mind, another voice stirred. A faint, forgotten voice that held him back from the edge. What if this isn't the answer? What if things can change? This voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to keep him from taking that final step. Suddenly, Josh jolted upright as if surfacing from deep water. He glanced around, feeling something alive within him, something that still wanted to break free from this darkness. His hands shook as he looked at the open burners, torn between the crushing weight of his pain and the faint glimmer of a second chance. Then came the sound of sirens, growing louder by the second. The police and rescue teams were close, and the chaos in his mind intensified. He knew this was it, the final choice, to stay and face reality or disappear into the void forever. Tears stung his eyes, and he felt his heart clench in pain. Waves of emotion crashed over him. Anger, fear, despair. But beneath it all, a small part of him still wanted to live, a part he tried so hard to ignore. Outside, police cars with flashing lights surrounded his house, almost like a cage. He knew they were there, waiting, ready to stop him. But he saw it as just more indifference, another reminder that no one really understood. He inhaled deeply, even as the gas choked his lungs, his head spinning. To him, it felt like the whole world was a conspiracy against him, driving him toward oblivion. "I'll make them notice me," he muttered. "They'll finally know I was here." He took a step back, still clutching a match. His fingers shook, and he wasn't sure if it was fear or the thrill of having something so powerful in his hands. But in that last moment, something shifted. He saw Martha's face flash in his mind, her eyes filled with the last shred of hope she had for him. A voice boomed from the loudspeaker outside, breaking through his panic, trying to reach him in his pit of despair. "Josh, we're here to help you. This isn't the answer. Let us help." The words stuck in his mind, paralyzing him. Inside, a battle raged between his last shreds of sanity and the consuming darkness. An awful but oddly captivating thought arose. What if they're right? What if things could change? Where were they when he really needed them? That thought crept in like a poison, whispering that no one would ever understand his suffering. Josh's hands trembled even more, and the match in his fingers felt heavy, almost burning him. The thought of finally breaking free became tempting once more. Though Martha's face lingered in his memory, he felt disconnected from it. He looked at the burners, seeing them as his only way to peace. At that moment, the door burst open. The police, smelling the gas, had managed to break in, racing to save him. But as if in one last act of defiance, Josh struck the match and dropped it. For a split second, time froze, and his eyes locked onto the flames as they began to consume everything. But when the first wave of fire erupted, throwing him back, he felt something unexpected in those final seconds. A realization, cruel and harsh. This wasn't peace or release. It was something darker, a shadow of his own fear and despair. He understood that, even in this final act of destruction, he'd found no solace, no answer. The flames quickly took over his body, burning pain searing every inch of him. His breaths grew shallow, each inhale bringing the stench of gas and burning flesh. As his skin began to blister and peel, the agony intensified, eclipsing everything. In his last moments, as the fire engulfed him, Josh understood that nothing he'd done had brought him the freedom he'd sought. All that was left was a relentless emptiness, now filled with nothing but fire and pain. Like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment on what you'd like to see next. Share your thoughts and ideas. Your opinion matters. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that began with a whisper.